Hi, welcome back to the channel. I'm Michelle, and today I want to talk about my family's experience with COVID. And I want to talk about it for a couple of reasons. One, I think there's this mentality that COVID is not a big deal, or it's like a cold, you'll be fine, or that it's not even an issue anymore. We're so far from that, lockdown phase that it's not a big deal. And I think for some people it can be very mild, it can be no symptoms at all, but some people can get really sick from it. And I think, especially on social media, YouTube, things like that, people don't really talk about it. They talk about it. I've heard so many one-lines like, oh yeah, my family had COVID this last week, and that's it, and they continue with their story. They don't really talk about their experience with it. And I think talking about our experience is important so we understand that people have different experiences with COVID, and that's what's so interesting about it, is that within our own family alone, we had very different responses to getting COVID. So I'm going to talk about kind of how COVID progressed through each one of my family members and how it went for us. So to keep you up to date, we are all fully vaccinated and boosted except my youngest son, my 2-year-old. He was not eligible at the time. It's funny, the day he tested positive for COVID would have been the first day he was eligible to get a vaccine, which is disappointing. But COVID started with my husband. My husband is 37 years old. He's a type 2 diabetic. And this was our first time contracting COVID. We take precautions outside of our house. We still wear masks when we go out. We don't really go to restaurants because of my daughter's dietary restrictions. So that's never really been an issue, but we are still cautious when we go out because we take it seriously like we have the last 3 years. So my husband was fully vaccinated and boosted, but his booster was about 7 months prior to him getting COVID. So his immunity, I'm guessing, did go down over time, and being a diabetic, I think, plays into this too. So he unfortunately got it from someone at work. Someone came to work visibly sick, which is, I don't understand why we're still going to work and sick, especially when we have access to things like COVID tests for free. You can have them sent in the mail. I'll leave a link down below where you can fill out and they will send you tests in the mail for free. If you suspect you're sick, I don't care if it's a cold or a scratchy throat, just take the test and be a responsible person so you're not infecting other people. Because this person who came to work sick, my husband was the one, because he's the person in charge at work, who had to interact with this person and say, you're obviously not well, you need to go home and get better and come back when you're feeling better. And within that 10-minute interaction, my husband contracted COVID. And we know that because, again, that was the only person he was around sick, and he wears masks everywhere else. So on a Friday morning, my husband usually has Fridays off, he woke up with a really bad headache and a sore throat. And he didn't think much of it. He had been working a long week, a lot of meetings. And I said, you should probably test just to make sure, because that night he was leaving for a conference meeting where he'd be in a hotel for the weekend and around a lot of people. And I said, just be responsible and mindful. Just take the test, make sure it's not anything else. So he took the test, and lo and behold, it was a positive. It was positive right away. And we've taken quite a few COVID tests over the last couple of years because if we get a sniffle or a sore throat, we are those people that make sure we test before we go out and interact with a bunch of people. So immediately my husband went to quarantine in our room, and he was feeling all right that day. That night he got a really high fever. It was above 103, I believe. And he started taking Tylenol. He woke up Saturday feeling miserable. He had pretty much all the symptoms of COVID. He had the body aches, he had the chills, the fever, the vomiting. By Saturday night, he developed a really bad cough, and it lasted it was an intense cough, and lasted till Monday. And it wasn't a wet cough, it was very dry, but the type that shakes your entire body and makes your muscles hurt from coughing so much. So he pretty much just laid in bed. I made sure I checked on him. We had a pulse oximeter? The thing that measures your oxygen level. We had one of those. He was in contact with his doctor, of course, during this time, and he just had a really bad go of it and pretty much laid in bed. So I was taking care of everything else, and of course this was difficult having the other parent down. I'm obviously not going to invite friends or family to come help me over because I'm not going to expose other people to COVID. That would be irresponsible. So I was doing my best to manage what was going on. And it was difficult. And then by Sunday, my husband was feeling a little bit better, like he could get up and be functional, but his body was just wrecked and he was still coughing. So by Monday, about 4 a.m., my youngest woke up, my son, my 2-year-old, woke up crying, and we all as mothers know what it means when our children wake up in the middle of the night crying. He was sick. So I went in there, he was burning up, like literally to the touch. I think when I took his temperature, he was 102.5. So I was like, ugh, here we go. So I immediately gave him his COVID test, and again, it came back positive. My 9, 5, and me, the rest of us that were still healthy took COVID test and came back negative. My son came back positive. Unfortunately, my husband was not feeling well enough to help with him, even though they both had COVID and could, technically quarantine together. He was not in a state to take care of my 2-year-old son. And my 2-year-old son by far had the worst experience out of any of us. And I think that's important to talk about because I think especially with young kids, it's often portrayed as it's a cold, or most of them don't even realize they're sick, those types of things. No, my son was sick. He was miserable. So he tested positive Monday, and again, he had a very leaky nose, and he had a high fever. And his fever lasted for 3 days straight. It was a continuous high fever. He was 103.5, almost around the clock for 3 days. When we gave him Tylenol, it would go down to, I think, 100.5. So it never really went below a low-grade fever. But as soon as the Tylenol wore off, it would shoot up immediately to 103.5. And it was rough. When you touched him or I held him, he was so warm that he would make me sweat. My body would start sweating because he was just like so hot. And he was miserable. He didn't want to do anything. He just wanted to lay there. And he had the saddest look on his face. And I could tell his throat hurt because he would point to it. And I would say probably Tuesday, he developed a wet cough. And much like my husband, it was the cough that shakes your body, that he would cough so hard he would puke. And it got to the point where I would have to hold him, I would have to hold his chest and his back to brace him when he coughed because it was so hard on his little body and he was exhausted, and it was very hard to sleep because of the coughing, because most of the time when you have drainage and things like that, it's in your sinuses and things like that, so if you prop yourself up, it helps. But the weird thing about COVID is it wasn't in his sinuses, it was all sitting in his chest, so there was no position he could really lay in comfortably that he wasn't profusely coughing. So he was like that, I said, for 3 days, and it was really, really difficult. Running the household, making sure everyone was fed and taken care of my very unhappy 2-year-old son that he just wanted to lay there. That's all he wanted to do. And if I tried to leave, he would scream and start profusely coughing, and then that would start vomiting. And it was extremely difficult because my 9 and 5-year-olds still needed, they needed their meals, they needed clean clothes, they needed all these things. So for me as the caregiver, it was extremely difficult. And I don't think that's talked about a lot. I was lucky enough to be healthy through most of this, but emotionally and physically, I was exhausted. It was draining everything I had out of me. And luckily, we got through it. It was definitely the survival mode, because once my husband started feeling better, a couple days later, my youngest son started feeling better. He had a persistent cough for about, I would say, 2 weeks after his COVID week. So, but he would eventually get up and move around, and he never had a trouble eating or drinking. He was just miserable most of the time. And of course, we were in contact with his pediatrician throughout this, but unfortunately at 2, there's not much you can do. So as soon as my 2-year-old his fever broke and he showed signs of improvement, lo and behold, I started showing symptoms. It's like my body realized, okay, everyone's gonna be okay. Now we're shutting down. So it was my son and my husband had very intense 3 or 4 days. I would say mine was milder but lasted longer, and I think probably because my body was just sheer exhausted. It was very hard for my body to kick whatever this was. I would often feel horrible, feel like I was better, and then I would dip down back to feeling horrible. So it was like this roller coaster for a good 7 days. And I had low-grade fever, I had body aches. But, you know, when mom's sick, mom still has to get up and do things. My husband was able to help a lot more, but he had a really bad cough, and a lot of movement made him cough bad. So I still had to help somewhat while being sick. And it was really, really hard. It was definitely survival mode. Like I said, how we got through it. My 9 and 5-year-old never had any symptoms. My 9-year-old did say she was tired, but that could have been because she was helping me out so much throughout a lot of this that she was just exhausted from helping. But my 9 and 5-year-old were boosted 3 weeks prior to us coming in contact with COVID, so I think that had a lot to do with it. Their bodies were ready and prepared and good to go, while the rest of us, not so much. And I talk about this because I think it's important to share different experiences people have with COVID, that it's still out there, it's still a real thing, that you can do the responsible thing. If you're sick, get tested, don't go out, don't infect other people. I think it's pretty common sense, but if the last couple of years have shown us anything, there's not a lot of common sense out there. And to emphasize that even if you're one of those that are healthy, taking care of those that are sick is difficult. And you can see in some of my videos that even after I got better, I still had a cough for a while. Even now, if I talk for long periods of time, or if I'm reading to my kids like a chapter book, I will start to lightly cough. And it took about a month for that to go away. So I had my week of COVID, and then about a month, I would still continue to cough if I did a lot of activity or if I was reading or talking a lot. And one thing I had that nobody else in the house had was I lost my taste and smell, which was so disappointing. And it wasn't just for like a week, I lost it for a good month. And it's very weird to not be able to taste anything. Smell, I don't really think much of, but taste, because I'm the one that usually cooks most of the meals. I couldn't tell if I was seasoning things well. I couldn't taste chocolate, which makes me very sad because chocolate is my favorite thing. And I couldn't taste it for a month, so it was kind of taking the joy out of food. So that was difficult. And like I said, it took a month for my cough and my taste and smell to come back. And it was not this easy cold. You know, I have 3 kids, I'm 35 years old. I know what it's like to go through flus and colds and sicknesses. This was not anything like that. It was very difficult for my son. It was difficult for my husband. Even for me, I'm 35, I'm relatively healthy, I would say. We eat a pretty decent diet. It was still difficult for us. And I think some people will be like, well, you know, this just proves the vaccine still works. I think it does the opposite, actually. Going into the vaccine, our only goal was that it helps prevent hospitalizations and death. I think that's all we can really hope for out of a vaccine. We weren't thinking it was going to stop us from getting COVID. We're not that naive, but especially with my husband, he would be considered higher risk because of his diabetes. We knew it was the safest thing to do. And lo and behold, the ones that are most recently vaccinated had absolutely no issues. So I think the vaccines definitely saved my husband from being hospitalized. I don't doubt that with how intense it was for him even being vaccinated, that he would have ended up as one of those people in the hospital needing extra care. And I was really surprised with how rough it was with my 2-year-old, because you don't often hear about the younger kids dealing with harsher cases of it. So that is our experience with COVID. If you have any questions, leave them down below. If not, thank you for watching.